So when we talk about what is Parliament, a building in the geographical centre of London, so it's always going to be essentially surrounded by London. That's kind of what the idea was. I think initially as well, it was a really good idea to put it in the middle, just that if, for example, there is an invasion or something, then Parliament is like the last thing to be taken, if you see what I mean. Palace of Westminster is still called a palace because it is owned by the Queen, therefore has to be a palace of sorts. And one of the things that you've got to remember is that the Queen can take residence, or residents live there, but because she is allowed to attend there within the House of Lords, it is technically designed as a palace. This is just thinking about this between the difference between what the UK Parliament is and for example, the French Parliament or the US one. Okay, it's not where technically the president resides because he doesn't need to. He has the Oval Office, he has the White House, whereas they have Capitol Hill. So that's very different. So thinking about a central body of legislature in a monarchy or a constitutional monarchy is very different to a federal state. Okay, sovereign body essentially that is where the constitution is always being made. Okay, that's always being made and created. In terms of statutes. What are the other three ways of changing the constitution? Remember, we have statute law. What was it? Sorry? Common law by the judiciary of the two.
Authority work.
Works of authority, yeah.
Authority.
Well, yeah, same thing. And the other one?
Rights. Increase rights.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, not really. Not that. It's conventions.
Oh, I said that.
You said that. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Yeah, by constitutional conventions, unwritten stuff. Okay. Remember, so that Parliament always has the power to give and take away. So, if, for example, the Stormont or the Scottish Parliament is overstepping its mark, or Parliament, this UK Parliament says, you've had too much power, it can always get things taken away. So it's basically. That's where sovereignty lies, and everywhere else in the UK is where power lies, okay? Going over what we know before, okay? Yeah, and the government must be members of the House of Commons or the Lords. Essentially, this is what we'll go into when we go talk about history, is that the government used to be, of course, the king and his advisors, okay? The fact that now they always have to come from those two areas is a very different, massive step from where it used to be, and that's what we're going to talk about in this sort of more history-orientated lesson. So yeah, this is where debate, policy is essentially mentioned, and listen to criticism, and that's where they always have votes. They don't really have votes and parliamentary votes anywhere else but the building. This is kind of obvious. And also just reiterating, the government is separate from Parliament, okay, in terms of an executive and a legislature. The two, and knowing the difference between the two and the relationship between the two in our country is vital to know. Okay, so I had to go over that. So, in terms of the history of Parliament, it's called the mother of all parliaments. It's the first modern form of what we consider to be a democratic gathering of loads of people, otherwise known as creating a legislature. Okay, it's the mother of it, because although there are some versions of it in ancient Greece, for example, and in ancient Rome, it's always been a bit too far away, essentially, because we had basically a long period of time in history of like despotic monarchies, okay, that sort of went in between those two, and it's like they're like what we consider to be like classic republics is what we used to call them, but they didn't have what we consider to be a parliament. But that's where we got the idea from. We got the idea of an elected chamber, elected by a certain amount of people, and those people are then sort of discuss things and then vote on them. Really, the difference is between ancient Greece and Rome and now, I suppose, is that they had more of a despotic monarch, or how do you say, head of state, which could act independently of the Senate, as they used to call it. But Parliament is when the executive and the legislature are in some ways like very closely linked. That's the idea of it. That's why we consider ours to be the mother of all parliaments, because that's how we made it, I suppose. The first English Parliament met in 1265, so that's a long, long time ago. I think it was the Simon de Montfort Parliament, and we'll have a look at that, quick look at that today as well. It's the model of other parliaments across the world, and whilst people rail at the British Empire, I'm not one of them. I see that bit as sort of necessary, really, in many ways. It's a product of empire because, you know, New Zealand's got a parliament, Australia's got a parliament, Canada's got a parliament, but in America, if you think about it, whilst it has a Congress and a Senate, that's a form of parliament. Okay, they just gave it a different name. And think of all the other areas as well that actually thought about it that weren't part of the empire. So we're talking about France has 2 elected chambers. In fact, France has exactly the same political system as America. Okay, quite interesting to note that. However, other parliaments and assemblies show different functions, so it's not all the same as the UK Parliament. Remember the UK Parliament and the Constitution, that's very different to a lot of other codified areas, okay? So countries with codified constitutions and a parliament's going to have a very, very different function. Very different, whereas our one, it is much more powerful because it can do so much. Kings of England and Queens, have always had a royal council of some sort. So looking back in history at that time, there's always been a royal council. There's always been a collection of advisors, smart people, hand-picked people mostly at the time. So there's always been some form of government in general. Of course, back then, the king had almost supreme dictatorial powers, or powers given to him by God. But there's always been some sort of royal council. So when you think about where the idea of a parliament is, where the idea of an executive is, which is not from one person but quite a few, you always have to look as far back as history and finding out that actually we already had some form of royal council. And sovereignty used to lie in the hands of the king. So there was no need for a parliament, okay? So the king had absolute sovereignty. So you can see where the sovereignty sort of essentially is now seeping down, really, as we go further into history. So there was no need for a parliament initially. That's why the first one met in 1265. You bet your case that is because they rejected the idea of the king being sovereign. Okay? And when we briefly look at Magna Carta, that's kind of the first time where we're now drawing sovereignty, not power, sovereignty from the king at some point. And that keeps going down and down until with the Act of Settlement in 1701. And the House of Lords is the surviving child of the royal councils, okay? And explains the weird traditions that they actually still have a lot of the times, especially when it comes to the visitation of the monarch to the House of Lords. There's lots of different routines that they go through, actually. Quite a few, really. So the House of Lords is the last legacy of that royal council. I mean, the best way to remember it is that the House of Lords used to have much more power than the Commons. So you can see where that sort of sovereignty has really like seeped down like water from the top all the way to the bottom to the House of Commons. And the monarch no longer presides over meetings in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. The Queen really only now turns up to Parliament when she's providing a Queen's speech. Apart from that, she's never like sitting in listening to the House of Commons. She might be on the TV, but she's not there in the actual chamber itself. She's not allowed in the House of Commons, if you remember from the little quiz. But in the House of Lords, she's not really allowed to sit in on that as well. But only the tradition reminds us that they used to do that. You know, that's why there's still a royal throne technically in the House of Lords itself all the time. Okay, so it's amazing just how many traditions are still there, just to remind us of how governance used to be. Okay, which is very, very different to what we think of it now. So now let's have a look. Let's go all the way back to Magna Carta. This is a very small little BBC Learning video. It's kind of fun, but it kind of gives us an idea of of where it all began, I suppose. So it's quite a shortish video, but worth looking at, really.
Stories from Parliament. Magna Carta. England, February 1215. and all is not well. Across the country, from north to south, the voices of angry barons can be heard. The cause of their anger? One man.
King John. He demands even higher taxes to pay for his futile wars in France.
And if we do not pay off, he takes what he wants. We have to find a way to stop him raising taxes whenever he chooses.
And taking our land.
Or stealing our
He
land.
promised that all this would stop.
Oh, he always promises.
His promises mean nothing. We must do something to make him keep his word.
We are the barren lords of England, yet he shows us no respect.
He can arrest us and hold us prisoner without a bail.
Our widowed sisters and mothers can be forced into a marriage just because the king orders it.
Our rights and freedoms should be protected by law.
Oh, King John believes he is above the rule of law.
Then we must have new rules, which even a king must obey.
And it is not just the barons who believe it is time to act. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself intervenes.
He may be above the laws of men, but no one is above the laws of God.
Pray silence for Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
My lords, you have come here today from all corners of England. Tell me, what are your concerns? Robert Fitzwalter, Lord of Dunmow Castle, speak first.
My lords, when our king raises taxation yet again, he offends the people. When he seizes lands that do not belong to him, he offends the barons. And when he seizes the wealth of the church, he offends God.
Richard de Clare, Earl of Hertford, you wish to speak?
My Lord Fitzwalter is right, but what can we do? The king cannot be reasoned with. He's too powerful.
Then we must find a way to limit his powers.
How will we do that? There are no rules which a king has to obey.
We will make new rules.
He won't listen to us. He refuses to recognize our rights. We have no voice.
Then we must declare our rights and find a voice. We must send a clear message to the king. He must agree to limit his power.
And if he does not agree,
then together we will raise a great army. We will take London and leave him no choice.
But even when he knows that the barons are taking action, King John continues to raise taxes and seize lands which do not belong to him.
Your Majesty, the rebels advance towards London.
really, let them advance where they like. I have nothing to fear from Robert Fitzwalter and his rabble.
They gather support, Your Majesty. The closer they get to London, the stronger they become.
I told you, I have nothing to fear. The people of London will stand by their king.
Not so sure, Your Majesty. Fitzwalter calls his troops the army of God. I believe the people of London are on his side.
I don't care. I don't care whose side the people are on. I will not submit. No king of England will ever obey rules laid down by traitors.
A messenger from London, Your Majesty.
Approach, speak,
Your Majesty, Fitzwalter is in London.
and
The people cheer him.
they cheer a rebel traitor who dares to stand against his king.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Perhaps, Your Majesty, it is time to talk to the rebels.
Never. I am the king of England. I do not talk to traitors.
But King John will talk. He has no choice. And on the 15th of June, 1215, at Runnymede near Windsor, the two sides meet. The barons present the king with a document. 63 rules have been written down on parchment. This will become one of the most important and famous documents in history. People will call it the Great Charter, Magna Carta.
Force widows to marry against their will.
Agreed.
You will not raise taxes without the agreement of the barons.
Agreed.
No free man can be imprisoned without being charged.
Agreed.
Every man has the right to a fair trial.
Agreed.
And 25 barons will watch you carefully to make sure that you obey these rules.
Agreed.
King John places his royal seal on the document so that the whole world will know that he has agreed to obey these new rules. Of course, this document doesn't put an end to the quarrels between kings and barons. Some of the rules are quickly changed, and many are broken or ignored. But on the 15th of June, 1215, something important has happened. Magna Carta has shown for the first time that it is possible to lay down rules which even a king must obey. Some of those rules apply to this day.
Great video. They take it very seriously. But it's a big deal really, because essentially it was squaring the whole of how do you legislate, how do you limit the powers of someone, a king, who is not there because he's been elected, because he's been put there by God. It's very difficult to come up with or to sort of think about how do we limit those powers. And actually that's why Magna Carta is so important, is because it's the first time a king has had his powers limited. Okay, so that's why we think about it. That's why we call that the start of what you consider to be some form of, I suppose, democracy, but where the idea of a parliament or royal council, or in this case, if you saw from the video, the idea of barons overseeing the powers of a king, okay, actually that's where it comes from. So it's really, really important to know that's where the whole idea of maybe some sort of constitutional monarchy is coming from, okay? And that's the big difference between, for example, England and what would turn out to be France, okay? So in terms of how we think about it today, the House of Commons developed separate to the Lords, okay? The first meeting in 1265, as I mentioned previously, where the first Parliament, I put there as a massive quotation marks, meets in Westminster Hall. So we're talking about just like a big room, which actually is still there today, funnily enough. Okay, of course it's being zhuzhed up and electrified, but that's where they first met. In fact, you can go there and there's a plaque saying, you know, this is where the first Parliament met. Okay. And Simon de Montfort, a rebellious nobleman, they all come from rebellious noblemen, calls the first meeting. Okay, and this was actually separate to what the king wanted. He didn't actually like the idea. And the first Parliament, 1265, is, and this can't come as a shock, it's not elected. It's a lot of knights and 2 wealthy peasants from each town allowed to come. So it's a big gathering. The 2 wealthiest peasants from each town and all the knights. Okay, so we're talking about a big gathering of people come to discuss things. Okay, nothing like comes out of these discussions, obviously, because we're talking about 1265 where kings still are sovereign. This parliament is not sovereign, therefore it meets with no hint of like any powers because they've not been given any by the king, and it's not enshrined in law or in any constitution. Okay. Remember what they said about Magna Carta? Yes, it developed rules and laws, but of course a lot of them got broken, but it at least codified, there we go, this word again, codified some form of rules. And so we're now establishing so we're still talking about the Constitution in some way, but now we're talking it from a more historical point of view, and where does Parliament fit into this, okay? So this first Parliament, technically the first one in 1265, is a in quotation marks, representative body of people. The first of its kind outside of ancient Rome? I say yes, okay? Absolutely, because you're talking about peasants, that could be anyone who's just made a lot of money, okay? So in some ways it's not representative of the people, not at all, okay? But it's a representative body, rather than a king, an emperor, Caesar, or some sort of Eastern version. I'm not sure what they're caliph, I'm not sure. But it's the first time outside of a single person that a group of people has ever come together. So 1265 is a big deal. Yes, I told you it is a history lesson in many ways. And they have the authority to govern without acceptance of some representation is weak, without divine power and military authority. So back then, if you didn't have divine power, or power given to you by God, that's how power essentially given, okay, or sovereignty, I suppose, over a country, and you didn't have the military authority behind you, backing you, you can't really govern. Which is why this, I'll talk about it in a second, this parliament essentially just dissolves and nothing comes of it, okay? But yes, it's the authority to govern without the acceptance of some representation. However, it is the basis of ruling by parliamentary popularity. So rather than ruling by divine might and by military might, it's the idea of ruling by parliamentary popularity, by popularity in some form of politics. That's a huge deal. That's a huge shift from, God gives me the right, or does it come from the people? So this is the first time that actually that question is being asked, okay? This is why we have to go back in history, because you have to think theoretically at Parliament. We've come a long way, and if you think about it, it took us about 800 years to get it right. Well, in a way, you can say that, because we still have an unelected House of Lords. We have a first past the post system. But if you think about it, it was only 1265 that we started thinking maybe we should rule by parliamentary popularity rather than with military authority, see? And even then, countries were still going up to, even today, how many countries are not democratic? How many countries are still ruling by military authority or divine right? You have to look at, Saudi Arabia, okay? Or you can look at North Korea. You can look at many different countries who still haven't made this transition. We did it in 1265. That's pretty impressive. And why does that? So whenever people ask me, well, how has Britain endured? How did Britain become a massive empire? Because we did things so early. We got it right, essentially. I'd say a good 400 or 500 years before anyone really did. That's how to build an empire. You get it right really early, or you get it really wrong, okay? So this is a very important thing, okay? The idea of ruling by parliamentary popularity, or being popular in general. So let's talk about the emergence of Parliament. Yes, it's another one of these mildly cringy videos, okay? I love it.
Stories from Parliament. Simon de Montfort. England, 1263. It is 48 years since Magna Carta was sealed by King John. Now his son Henry is on the throne, but tensions between the king and the barons continue. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, is married to the king's sister Eleanor. De Montfort is one of the most powerful men in England, and he is angry. Just 5 years earlier, King Henry made a promise to de Montfort and the barons in Oxford. Here he agreed to place the power of the kingdom under a council of 15 barons. De Montfort has heard that Henry plans to break this promise. Now he waits for news with his wife, Lady Eleanor.
Has the messenger come?
Not yet, but I'm sure it is a false rumour, my lord. King Henry made his promise.
Eleanor, your brother is desperate for money. The council have refused to raise taxes again, but it is rumoured he simply asks the sheriff to find the money another way. He will do whatever it takes. His promises mean nothing.
But the council has
The
said...
king does not listen to the council. The king is not listening to anyone. The agreements he made in Oxford mean nothing to him.
But he knows that the people will raise their voices in anger if he breaks his promise.
The king cannot hear the voices of the people, however loud they shout. But one day, I swear, he will hear them. One day, we will find a way to bring not just the barons, but representatives of the people from all across the country. And then the king will hear them speak. and we will make him listen.
My lord, news from London.
Speak.
The promise is already broken.
My brother has gone against his word?
Yes, my lady.
Then, my lord, you know what you have to do.
I must march against the king, your brother.
Yes.
There will be war.
You are a better man than Henry, a stronger man. The people know that. They will follow you. The time is right, Simon. Fight the king and make him listen to the people.
You, take a message to Gilbert the Red. Tell him to call a meeting of the barons. Together we will raise an army, and the king will hear our voice and feel our anger.
London. The Earl of Clare, known as Gilbert the Red, has called a meeting of the barons. All are agreed that the time has come to stand against the king, but not all are sure that Simon de Montfort is the right man to lead a rebellion.
I have no love for de Montfort. They say he is only interested in securing his own wealth and power.
If de Montfort leads our army and defeats the king, and who knows how much power he will seize for himself.
He's already married to the king's sister. Perhaps he believes that one day he could become king himself.
Gilbert the Red, what do you say?
Simon de Montfort must be our leader. Our soldiers admire him. And besides, the people love him.
The people? Who cares about the people?
De Montfort cares. He stands up for England, and the people know it. That is why he will. That is why he must lead us.
Spring, 1264. De Montfort's army is on the move. On May the 14th, they face the king's army at Lewes. The Bishop of Chichester visits the king, trying to prevent a terrible battle.
Your Majesty, it is not too late. Montfort is prepared to talk.
Our army outnumbers his 2-1. He will not beat us, not today.
Montfort is a strong leader.
Montfort is injured. I've been told that he cannot even ride a horse. How will he lead his men into battle with a broken leg?
He will find a way to lead them, Your Majesty, and they will follow him.
And my men will follow me. Steward, more wine.
So, what shall I tell Montfort?
Tell him to prepare to die.
The Battle of Lewes drags on, but Simon de Montfort leads his troops well. He has given them a cause to fight for.
We fight today so that the voice of England can be heard. And when we win this day, our voices will ring out across the years, so that Henry and every king and queen who follows him will hear us.
De Montfort's men fight ferociously and destroy the king's army. Finally, the king is captured, and those of his men who are still alive and have not been seized flee the battlefield. And so, my lord, you have the king in your power. What happens now?
A parliament, my lady. That is what happens. We will make a new parliament, and this time it will not be filled with barons and lords. This parliament will have representatives from every corner of England. There will be knights from every county, and citizens from towns and cities, and these men will be chosen by the people. And when our new parliament speaks, this time the king will listen.
December the 14th, 1264. The call goes out. Choose 2 representatives and send them to London. Simon de Montfort's parliament doesn't last long, and it is by no means perfect. But on the 20th of January, 1265, when the representatives sit down together for the first time, the country takes one more step on the long road to parliamentary democracy.
I think it's just, I love it. That's such a good pick. This is why we do history. That's why I do history. Okay, I'll be really quick with this one, and then that'll be it. So, the De Montfort Parliament Rebellion only meets 3 times before it's eventually removed. Because essentially, whilst it's a nice idea to be ruling by, or at least meeting together with parliamentary popularity, you still have to have some sort of divine power and some sort of military authority behind you, okay? And this won't really occur, probably until maybe the English Civil War, but that's something to think about. But it's the first parliament defined as an assembly of the Commons, and that is why we call it the House of Commons. Because it's the De Montfort Parliament that calls it a meeting of the Commons. So there you go, that's where we get the name from. It's a 1265 term. So whilst, again, it says it only meets 3 times before it's essentially removed, what actually happens is in 1272, so we're talking about, in about 6 or 7 years, King Edward I summons the Commons regularly, funnily enough. Admittedly as an advisory body, but this advice is coming from more commoners rather than it's considered to be like advisors, like king's advisors. So it's really interesting how actually, whilst it is removed, and you can, as you saw in the videos, it's been tussles between whether we should have it or not with regards to the king and the barons. Eventually, the king can see the point of having the Commons. Okay. So, what are the 3 functions of this Commons that meets essentially regularly, thanks to the king? It advises the king on proposed legislation, receives and distributes petitions from people regarding complaining against authority, and grants permission for the king to introduce new taxes. That is essentially what the government of today does, if you think about it. The only difference is that we're the ones who propose the stuff, or the Commons is the area that proposes the stuff. But remember, at the end of the day, it's the king or queen who has to give royal assent. Okay? So essentially, these 3 functions are still carried on today, all the way from 1272. The modern parliament has all these powers. Yes, it has more, it has different types now, but if you think about it, if you like strip down the bare bones of parliament, it pretty much does all that. Yeah, apart from the government has now taken the place of the king in many ways. So the king proposes legislation and the parliament advises on that. Okay? They receive and distribute petitions, or essentially elections, or in this way referendums as well, from the people regarding complaining against authority, or now about anything else these days. And granting permission for the king or the executive to introduce new taxes. There you go. That's what Parliament does. Every time that someone wants to bring in new taxes, it has to go through Parliament. It used to be the king who asked for that, and now it's the government. So this is what Parliament is doing, if you strip it down. Okay? So can you see that as we're developing from we're talking about the very, very early Middle Ages, the Dark Ages really, is that we're actually creating the semblance of what the House of Commons or Parliament is. Okay? So this is why I like history. This is why it's really, really important to know. Because that is where the basis of Parliament comes from. And if you can understand that, you can understand how it works today. Okay? If you go into the Houses of Parliament and no one tells you about how it came about in the first place, you just think that, it just magically came from the sky or from God or whatever. No, it came from a very long and very old process. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Brilliant. I'm going to call that there, guys. Well done. And we'll see you guys tomorrow, hopefully. We'll see.